Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to talk about heroes, or more accurately, the hero complex, which since ancient times has been absolutely part of our human psychology and originally seemed to have to do with the person through ingenuity, morality, courage, and strength could accrue to, usually back then, himself, glory, honor, power, or wealth. But today, is a hero really somebody who takes that kind of action in the world? Is there an interior or internal dimension to the hero? And we have lots of different kinds of heroes. We have everyday heroes, outlaw heroes, dark heroes, moral heroes, and the list goes on. And they are all parts of us as we take a look at them out there in the world, from superheroes to very humble heroes who do courageous things at home. So let's circumambulate the hero complex in as many of its facets as we can.
And maybe it would make sense to start off with a little bit of a definition, or at least taking a stab at that. Jim Hollis writes that the hero archetype is the primary metaphor for channeling libido in service to development. So I guess we can consider this one way of answering the question, what is the hero complex really about? So it's that part of us that seeks to channel life energy, what Jung called libido, in service to the development of the personality.
And what makes the hero archetype so compelling when it constellates inside of us is it leads us forward through powerful aspirations. That it's not just that we wake up one day and we think, oh, well, it would be a really good idea to move forward in this or that way. But the hero archetype can create a swell of heroic aspiration, a swell of personal power that then leads us to take a risk to move forward, and particularly to move against the torpor and infantile anxieties that many of us feel, particularly as young people, and gives us the courage to take a big step, like going off to college or applying for the job that reasonably you can't imagine that you'd get. But lo and behold, you show up, with a kind of vitality and discover that you can land that position. So something rises up, particularly in young people, to carry them across the abyss of childhood in an audacious act of self-development. And often once they arrive, people are shocked and they're struck with imposter syndrome.
Yeah. So, Joseph, if I can riff on what you said for a minute with just a sort of made up hypothetical case here, perhaps, of a young person who never really had a particular fire lit under them for any reason, but they sort of got to college with an amount of momentum, but it wasn't enough to carry them further, and so maybe they really struggled in college, or wound up having to take time off because they weren't really cutting it. And then perhaps the heroic energy wakes up in that young person, and he decides that I've got to figure this out. I've got to take charge of my own life. I've got to step up to the plate, whatever metaphor we want to use, and really be responsible for my own fate. I think there's something important there for the hero too, that there's a sense of being responsible for one's own life.
What I'm thinking about with all the courage and stepping up is how in ancient mythology, this was depicted in images of fighting. The ancient myth of Gilgamesh, all the stuff around Odysseus, mythic heroes like Theseus, they all fought. They slayed the proverbial dragons, conquered empires. Theseus killed the Minotaur. So there's something here about fighting, whether it's imaged as an external world enemy, or today we think of it more as internal world, conquering of fears, hesitations, a sense of inadequacy, and those impulses to just stay home in the protected realm.
I think that that's absolutely accurate. And there are people that come into my consulting room who do need some heroic energy to push past anxiety or apathy, or, the belief that they're only safe if they sort of stay nested in their cocoon. It absolutely is heroic energy that's required to slay those internal demons.
And this drive to slay the demons often constellates when there is a vision of the treasure, which can come in a dream, it can come in an intuition, and the treasure, whether it's gold or a golden goose or a magical lyre that sings to you, are metaphors for some potential inside of ourselves and for a true and authentic feeling about one's destiny. So often it's difficult to mobilize somebody against the dragons of their lives if they don't have at least a glimpse of the treasure. If Parsifal had never seen a glimpse of the Holy Grail, why would he possibly have left home and gone through this lifelong misery of searching? It's the glimpse of the potential that leads us onward. And that glimpse comes from even just a momentary encounter with the true self, long before we're actually mature enough to lay hold of it in its fullness. So when we get a glimpse of this higher potential, if we're lucky, the archetype of the hero will activate even in some small measure, which will grant us the will and capacity to tolerate the repeated transformations that one needs in order to pursue wholeness and meaning in one's life. Because that's a kind of agonizing grind of change that we all have to go through in order to attain the goal.
We've been talking about the heroic energy that is needed for growth, and we're really talking about how heroic energy is needed for the job of individuation, this idea of self-development that Jung put forward.
Well, I think that is a major theme, really, from time immemorial. And it certainly is one that we as Jungians would especially espouse and value, that what we do out there has an effect on what we're doing in here, and growing us, hopefully, into fullness of being, what we call individuation. But there are lots and lots of other images of heroes. And one that I think about that is, I think, unique to American culture is the loner cowboy hero. All the Clint Eastwoods and John Wayne types who did what they did their way on their own terms. Nobody tells me what to do. I can fight it out at the saloon or, somewhere on some dusty road. It seems to me to be more of an image of an individualistic, not individuated kind of hero.
Well, I'm also thinking about the fact that most of the time we think of heroes using their energy in service to some cause larger than self. So the hero is the redeemer of the culture. The hero saves the weak or fights oppression. We can think about this again as a metaphor for inner experience, but we also think about it importantly in the culture, in our own lives, in myths and fairy tales, as the way that the hero puts him or herself in service to something greater. And so I wonder, Deb, in terms of your image of these individualistic heroes, are they in service to something greater, would you say?
Well, that is exactly the question that I wanted to raise, because I think that there is a way that some of these heroes are more in service to an effort to be superior to external or physical reality, that they're constantly proving themselves as equal to combating whatever the forces are that are arrayed against them. And that it's not so much altruistic, although they may, save some people and do some good along the way. But it's more about something else, I think, about defeating enemies and proving oneself, and perhaps related to mortality, of to defeat death itself.
I'm thinking of Han Solo and in relationship to Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker has kind of the classic hero energy, and Han Solo really he just wants to get paid. But really deep down, he's quite invested in doing the right thing for the right reasons. But he looks like a bit like a grifter, and he's more of a kind of accidental hero.
I'm thinking about that term, the accidental hero, and finding oneself swept into a situation where you have to evidence capacities that you didn't know you had or didn't care to bring forward because the cost of them. And I'm also thinking about that kid, Greta Thunberg, who's become kind of a climate hero and starting out in whatever small way she did in her community, just championing her causes, and then being assigned a role in the collective now, where her very presence at certain events kind of rallies a heroic feeling. And she becomes an icon for that. And I'd like to say, of course, I don't know Greta, but I can imagine a kind of cost to her to take on all of those projections, both in terms of how inflating that could be for anyone, let alone a young person, but also to be constantly in the crosshairs of millions of people. It's a lot.
So you just landed on a word that I want to pick up in reference to my sort of cowboy idea and in reference to what we just talked about, which is inflation. That is something that is a real possibility and a danger in the hero complex is what happens when we are made larger than life or we believe ourselves to be larger than life. I think I'm just trying to bring the hero complex down to earth and infuse it with a little shadow here so that it's not entirely noble and altruistic.
Well, right. And I think, hopefully we'll circle back to talk more about everyday heroes, but heroes who get a lot of public acclamation for what they do wind up, the word I was going to pick up on from what Joseph said is projection. So heroes that get a lot of acclamation and attention wind up carrying all of these projections. And of course, that can result in inflation and can be very, very costly and dangerous. And by the way, it's been too long since I've seen this movie, but I believe that this is sort of the idea behind the life of Brian, right? That Brian is just kind of a regular guy who then receives all of these projections that he's the Christ. You guys are looking at me blankly. So.
I'm going like, who's Brian? I thought he was my son-in-law.
Right. Well, for those Monty Python fans out there listening, you can write in and tell me that I got it wrong. But I think it's sort of the Greta Thunberg story. It's like, suddenly you're singled out as the carrier of this energy. And you receive all of these projections, and then that kind of drives your destiny. I mean, I guess I'm also I may be having a totally made up fantasy about the movie, but I'm also maybe having a fantasy about Greta Thunberg. That this is somewhat chosen, but then it's also kind of thrust upon you. And then you are the bearer of the hero archetype. But of course, Christ is a real image of a kind of hero. So it's a heavy burden to bear, and it winds up often destroying people. I'm thinking of Elliot Spitzer, the one-time governor of New York, and he had this heroic quest to curb corruption in the financial services market. And then, just was lauded as kind of a hero of the common man. And then it found out that he had all this involvement with a prostitution ring, which just brought his career to a shuddering halt. So there's that way that when we're perceived as a hero or we're carrying those projections, or we ourselves see ourselves as heroic, we can get dangerously caught in inflation, which will often be followed by some kind of horrendous fall.
And this is such an important dynamic that Jung championed over and over again, is that the hero is an archetype, not a person. And even though human beings can be momentarily infused with heroic energy, maybe to the benefit of all in the community, but to reside in any archetype, the hero or anything else, begins to collapse the dimensionality of the human personality. So things like vulnerability or fragility, or even one's risk of being killed, all kinds of very reasonable human frailties are often minimalized or truly cut off and put into the unconscious, so that the heroic image is the dominant self-perception. And at that point, we can take risks that are mortally dangerous to us.
Or others.
And we feel that we are above consequences because archetypes never pay the price for anything because they aren't human. They're these transpersonal patterns that exist somewhere or other. And yet, individuals wind up paying a lot of prices. And heroes are often very ambivalent figures in the culture. An example that comes to mind is that fellow Edward Snowden, who was a military contractor and wound up sending off, thousands and thousands of classified files and dumping them into the public domain. He was lauded as an enormous criminal from the standpoint of the established government, but was also this kind of anti-hero, this teller of truth at great cost to himself and his own safety. And it's interesting to watch how the media and the collective framed him one way and then the other way and then back again and then back again. And it speaks to this fluidity of archetypal projection.
Yeah.
And of course, he is neither of those things. He's a human being who made a very complicated, costly decision. History will determine whether or not it was in service to liberating humanity or not. But he's a human person paying a big price.
Yes. And I suppose one of the reasons that we can think of him as a hero is because he did take a lot of risks to do what he thought was the right thing, which I think we can consider that a real quality of the hero.
But it calls up a real ambivalence here, the two-sidedness of the hero in terms of what is a whistleblower's motivation. It can be either way, that this is something bigger and more important, and I'm doing it in service to a greater truth. It could be what I think is a greater truth, and it might or might not be, depending upon how good my judgment is. And it might be, I'm going to take these guys down. I want to really blow them out of the water, and it's my opportunity for payback.
I think that's a great point, Deb, is sort of what is the motivation? What is one in service to? And of course, that is not always such a clear thing.
No.
I think another example of kind of a hero gone wrong would be Elizabeth Holmes, and I'm just obsessed with her story, as I think a lot of people are. She was the founder of Theranos, and she styled herself a hero, bringing this life-changing technology that was going to allow people to do a simple blood test with a prick of a finger that would diagnose all kinds of things, and it was going to transform healthcare. But of course, this was all smoke and mirrors. The technology was never there, and she wound up just defrauding untold numbers of people, their investors, their money, and as well causing real consequences for people who were relying on this so-called technology. I also want to lift up the way that the hero complex can manifest in our field. Most therapists go into this line of work because at one level or another, we want to help people. And we can sometimes get very caught up in the heroic aspects of our job, feeling that we are going to save people, we're going to make a difference in people's lives, we're going to be admired, people are going to feel so much gratitude. It can get us into real trouble. We can become inflated around that. We can take on cases that maybe we have no business taking on because we think, well, I can do that. We can get so caught up in needing to be admired and lauded as heroic that we have a great deal of trouble holding the negative projections or dealing with a negative transference. We can get blinded, and it can do a number on our boundaries. If we feel that we're heroic, we need to swoop in and save someone, we can collapse boundaries that can actually make situations more dangerous. So we have to be careful that we don't get swept up by the hero complex when we're in the helping profession. I mean, I think this is probably true for doctors and nurses as well, but I'm
clergy.
Thinking, yeah, but I can certainly relate to all of this.
So the hero complex sweeps us up with these gorgeous, sparkling possibilities for being big and doing right in the world. And what I think you're saying, Lisa, is we have to remember our own shadow and include that in the equation, which goes back to what you were saying, Joseph. of not identify with the archetype of the hero, but remember that we are human and we have limitations. And maybe that brings us back to the concept of the everyday hero rather than something so grandiose.
Yes, and I think when we can find the everyday hero, and particularly the hero who still has both a sense of humor and a sense of proportion that allows him to still be in the world, although he may be inspired by a vision of excellence for his or her role in the family, in the workplace, in the community. That's to me the sweet spot. And speaking, as you were saying, Lisa, to the heroic fantasies that all people in the helping profession can have, when I'm doing supervision, which I only do a bit of for other clinicians, the first thing that troubles me often is that new clinicians become humorless. It's like they're drowning in sincerity, which at first seems so heroic and sensitive and attuned and respectful. But the shadow side of it is that there's nothing that's paying attention to the absurd.
Oh, Joseph, that's just gorgeous.
Yeah.
So the therapist and, well, the analyst and the analysand, when they can laugh together, that's often an antidote to the poison of the hero, which doesn't make enough room for the absurdity of being human.
That's so true. Heroes are often humorless. I mean, think of like Superman. I mean, get a sense of humor, you know?
That is really wonderful. I'm thinking about so many heroes that seem to lack a sense of humor and a sense of fun, of really enjoying and reveling in the journey. And another word that comes up in this context is righteousness. Oh, some of our heroes out there are really, they are right and they are pure. And what they're fighting for is good in capital letters. And doesn't it strike us in this moment as sort of kind of deadly serious with no real life spark in it? But the hero can really get swept up in a righteous cause. Whether it's in the consulting room with sincerity or some sort of social justice type of cause.
Which again is so humorless. Much of the social justice rage seems to be churning around very questionable mistakes that somebody made in a Facebook post or in an email from 10 years earlier, and is brought forward without context and without a sense of humor at all about these things, which is so painful to watch. I did want to swing back, Deb, to your comment about the everyday hero, because as well as humor being something of an antidote to the archetype when it gets too big, humility.
Yeah,
which is related to the word humus and soil.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. That the hero needs humility, and this is back to this idea of the everyday hero. And Jim Hollis has this really beautiful description of that I want to share. This is from his book Mythologems. He says, "The hero task is apparent in the humblest of lives, especially in those who rise wearily and go off to demeaning labor to support their families. It is seen in the willingness of any person to sacrifice creature comforts, narcissistic interests, personal agendas on behalf of a larger value. We do not customarily accord these persons hero status, but their acts renew the world each day, redeem it even, as a place of enduring value."
And that grounded, soulful, kind way of honoring heroic energy, and it's the heroism to not give up on what life requires of us and its need to be tended.
Even when it's thankless.
Even when it's thankless. And I'm reminded of a poem that I'm so fond of called Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. It's just 3 little stanzas. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So that poem, so beautiful and so small in one way, but striking so deep, certainly moves me as I recall the austere and lonely offices of my own life. And I think of my grandfather and grandmother and the faithful, small ways that they tended us as children without seeking reward for that.
There's no glory.
There's no glory in much of that heroic sacrifice to smaller moments of life.
Something you said really resonates with me, Joseph, of not giving up on what life itself requires of us, even when it's thankless. And that is the service to something greater, something that is not ego oriented. And maybe that's part of the difference between, some of these big, noble public figures that are in the news all the time, or the cowboy who has the shootout at the OK Corral, versus being in service to what life requires, what life presents us with, what life itself demands of us in the way of duty and just the daily grind sometimes.
And bringing it back to Jung's observations, the father that this poet is remembering, undoubtedly each morning when it was ice cold, some part of him thought, God, I'd rather stay in bed. I'd rather stay sleepy and warm and not worry about other people's needs, which Jung thought of as the mother complex, the part of all of us that would rather be comfortable and unbothered. And yet something inside the poet's father rose up and gave him enough determination to brace the cold of these winter mornings and remember his duty and his caring of his family in these quiet and often unacknowledged ways. And the resistance, again, to the part of us that just doesn't want to do this thing one more time. And yet, the heroic of us do get up and we do what's required.
You know, I'm thinking about the contrast between these kinds of heroic energies that we've been talking about, these self-righteous energies that propel us to do daring and sometimes dangerous things in the name of rescuing or helping, and how that can be so important. I mean, that is an important phenomenon that we wouldn't want to discount, because much good has been done because of those kinds of motivations. And then we've been talking about this humbler, quieter kind of heroic energy. And what's the relationship between these two things? I find myself wondering. And it seems that there comes a time, perhaps, when we must sacrifice our identification with the hero in the first sense of the word. Sometimes we find that we have to give up our need to be seen as the great hero, as the one who is going to save someone who will be praised, who knows the right way. Heroes in the mythical sense, they don't have a lot of doubt. And they're not very funny, but they also don't have doubt. They know that they're right. And so I wonder if it isn't a task of midlife to let go of that heroic attitude and trade it for this second kind of heroic attitude that we've been talking about, that's illustrated so beautifully in that poem.
That strikes as truth, Lisa, that I think we talked about a bit earlier, that there's a kind of heroism that needs to help us transition from our teen years into being young adults, and the kind of heroic audacity that it takes to overcome our fears and insecurities and trying all kinds of new things, many of which may not work out well for us. But there is a point where the hero is not dimensional enough to allow a fuller aspect of ourselves to come through.
I really like this transition from the mythical classical hero who has no doubt and rides off to slay dragons, and how it's portrayed in mythology as a kind of conquering ingenuity, courage, strength, talent, and capability. And I think maybe our whole cultural drift over these eons has been toward a different kind of hero that we also equate with the second half of life, of a turning inward that has more to do with self-awareness and morality, a consciousness of what am I in service to? Beyond my own fame, glory, wealth, etc., what am I in service to that is something greater, like what you read about in the poem, Joseph? And what I think we see as heroes out there in the culture, like, Frodo and Sam Gamgee in the Tolkien myth, Huckleberry Finn, Florence Nightingale, Harriet Tubman, a lot of everyday heroes who were in service to something that wasn't just about them.
And so that speaks to the death of the solar hero. So the young part of ourselves that rises into the noonday sky of our life and is blazing and radiant and beautiful and full of mental power and physical power. But that can reach a point where we're exhausted, spiritually exhausted from carrying so much light and so much consciousness and so much drive. It makes me think of a particular stanza in a Leonard Cohen song. The lyrics of his songs are marvelous, but I'm thinking about a not well-known song, a tribute to Joan of Arc. And in this song, the fire within which Joan of Arc will be burned at the end of her life is haunting her in the beginning of the song, and she and the fire are having a dialogue leading towards this destination of her being burned alive. And in one of the stanzas, she says, "I'm tired of the war. I want the kind of work I had before, a wedding dress or something white to wear upon my swollen appetite." And I think that's a moment of self-realization, one could imagine, that right at the apex of the solar attitude, we begin to feel that we are swollen by our own appetites, wanting too much, constantly pursuing a goal, constantly assuming more and more control of the inner and outer environment. And at a certain point, we become exhausted. And just as the lyric says, I want the kind of work I had before.
Mm-hmm.
Jung also has a few stanzas in the Red Book and in a section he calls Murder of the Hero, which he's referenced actually in some of the other writings, but is unpacked in this poetic way. And Jung introduced something which is rather radical, or was radical at that time in his own psychological growth, which is the need for the heroic and solar attitude to die in order for something that is more connected to the unconscious, to the darkness, to the mystery to emerge. And so I'll just read the few paragraphs here we can toss it out as a point of discussion. And for those of you that have a copy of the Red Book, the large coffee table version, this is page 241 and 242. On the following night, however, I had a vision. I was with a youth in high mountains. It was before daybreak. The eastern sky was already light. Then Siegfried's horn resounded over the mountains with a jubilant sound. We knew that our mortal enemy was coming. We were armed and lurked behind a narrow rocky path to murder him. Then we saw him coming high across the mountains on a chariot made of the bones of the dead. He drove boldly and magnificently over the steep rocks and arrived at the narrow path where we waited in hiding. As he came around the turn ahead of us, we fired at the same time, and he fell slain. Thereupon I turned to flee, and a terrible rain swept down. But after this, I went through a torment unto death, and I felt certain that I must kill myself if I could not solve the riddle of the murder of the hero. Then the spirit of the depths came to me and spoke these words. The highest truth is one and the same with the absurd. This statement saved me, and like rain after a long hot spell, it swept away everything in me that was too highly tensed. Then I had a second vision. I saw a merry garden in which forms walked clad in white silk, all covered in colored light, some reddish and others bluish and greenish. I know I have stridden across the depths. Through guilt, I have become a newborn. We also live in our dreams. We do not live only by day. Sometimes we accomplish our greatest deeds in dreams. In that night, my life was threatened, since I had to kill my Lord and God not in a single combat, since who among mortals could kill a god in a duel? You can reach your God only as an assassin if you want to overcome him. But this is the bitterest for mortal men. Our gods want to be overcome, since they require renewal. If men kill their princes, they do so because they cannot kill their gods, and because they do not know that they should kill their gods in themselves. If the god grows old, he becomes shadow, nonsense, and he goes down. The greatest truth becomes the greatest lie. The brightest day becomes the darkest night. As day requires night and night requires day, so meaning requires absurdity and absurdity requires meaning. Day does not exist through itself. Night does not exist through itself. The reality that exists through itself is day and night, so the reality is meaning and absurdity. Noon is a moment, midnight is a moment, morning comes from night, evening turns into night, but evening comes from the day, and morning turns into day. So meaning is a moment and a transition from absurdity to absurdity, and absurdity only a moment and a transition from meaning to meaning. Oh, that Siegfried, blond and blue-eyed, the German hero, had to fall by my hand, the most loyal and courageous. He had everything in himself that I treasured as the greater and more beautiful. He was my power, my boldness, my pride. I would have gone under in the same battle, and so only assassination was left to me. If I wanted to go on living, it could only be through trickery and cunning. Judge not. Think of the blonde savage of the German forests who had to betray the hammer-brandishing thunder to the pale Near Eastern god who was nailed to the wood like a chicken marten. The courageous were overcome by a certain contempt for themselves, but their life force bade them to go on living, and they betrayed their beautiful wild gods, their holy trees, and their awe in the German forests. What does Siegfried mean for the Germans? What does it tell us that the Germans suffered Siegfried's death? That is why I almost preferred to kill myself in order to spare him, but I wanted to go on living with a new God. After death on the cross, Christ went into the underworld and became hell. So he took on the form of the Antichrist, the dragon. The image of the Antichrist, which has come down to us from the ancients, announces the new God whose coming the ancients had foreseen. Gods are unavoidable. The more you flee from God, the more surely you will fall into his hand. The rain is the great stream of tears that will come over the peoples. The tearful flood of released tension after the constriction of death had encumbered the peoples with horrific force. It is the mourning of the dead in me, which precedes burial and rebirth. The rain is the fructifying of the earth. It begets the new wheat, the young, germinating God. So the Red Book is sometimes this inscrutable mantic poetry that Jung had crafted from his notebooks, the Black Books. But among many things that I think he's reaching for here is that he needed to kill his old and inherited fantasy of what it meant to live a heroic life that had been deeply informed by his cultural heritage as well as his own natural psychic predisposition in order for something young, fertile, and germinating to emerge in him that was greater than what he had inherited from his culture. And that interrupting that inherited fantasy at first left him in total despair.
Siegfried was certainly part of German mythology and was very important symbolically to Jung. And just a little background on Siegfried. He was the perfect hero. He embodied strength and courage, courtesy, boldness, generosity. He was a wandering warrior. He did slay a dragon, and then he bathed in the dragon's blood, which gave him skin that was impenetrable. Like Harry Potter, he had an invisibility cloak. He had a special sword. I mean, he was just the quintessential hero. And Jung writes in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that the dream and this vision had showed him the attitude that he had, just what you were saying, Joseph, embodied by Siegfried, and that it no longer suited him. And he said he feels the grief a man feels when he's forced to sacrifice his ideal and his conscious attitudes. The identity and my heroic idealism had to be abandoned, for there are higher things than the ego's will, and to these one must bow. And so here we are. What comes after the heroic attitude?
Yeah, when you were reading, Joseph, and you were talking about how our gods, they want to be overcome because they want to be renewed, and otherwise the greatest truth becomes the greatest lie. I was thinking about Jung's father, who was a pastor, who had invested his whole life in the truths of Christianity, but they had grown stale and empty and meaningless to the elder Jung. And that made such an impression on young Carl Jung. And I think that is something that Jung knew and grappled with. And what he means by our gods want to be overcome and they want to be killed is that instead of just becoming inherited dry ideas that no longer can contain any life force, we need to challenge them and live into them so that they are alive in us. And he talks about the importance of absurdity. And I couldn't help thinking that the first time he killed the hero, he had this vision of killing Siegfried, but an earlier version of that was when he was an adolescent and he had this unthinkable thought come to him in the middle of Basel, and realized that the thought that wanted to come through was an image of God shitting on the cathedral in Basel, because something about God needed to be fresh and absurd and even transgressive to go beyond the tired, stale, inherited forms. But our ego can get very attached to a certain attitude, especially when when being attached to that attitude promises us that we'll be admired, that we'll be able to feel that we're in the right. So it is a lot to sacrifice that and open ourselves up to something that is fresh, but perhaps a little strange.
So assassinating the solar hero could look like admitting to oneself that the marriage doesn't work, that we went into the marriage with all of the solar brightness and promise and hope and integrity that we could muster in our mid-20s. And now maybe 20 years later, like Jung, one waits to deal the final blow in order to say goodbye to something that one has outgrown or no longer works. The same could be said for a career. We come into a career in our 20s, we're full of verve and dynamism, and we give ourselves to the great mission of the corporation that we're part of. And then we find ourselves again at some point waiting in the corners like an assassin to kill off the last bit of slavish loyalty to a corporation that doesn't really give a shit about us. But we have to get rid of this idea that we are the children of this corporation in order to free ourselves to consider a rebirth into this next stage of life, or perhaps a whole new career or a different work environment, and on and on and on.
Yeah, I think I was caught by the hero archetype when I was in my 20s, and I chose this career of working in international relief and development. And I was going to fight international poverty and help victims of international disasters and wars. And at 20, God, how old was I? 28? When I was 28, I went off to Bosnia. This was in the 1990s to work for a refugee organization. And I was going to, it was very heroic. It was a very heroic endeavor. And when I was there, the energy drained away from it. And part of that was recognizing that that the work we were doing was important in a way, but it wasn't really nearly as important as I thought it was in the scheme of things. And I mean, I could say more about that, but I don't know that this is the time now. But also that some other vision was constellating in me of what I might need to do in the world. And it was just as you're saying, Joseph, I had to kill that off, and it was very disorienting.
And Jung depicts in his description a determination from a conscious level that the ego itself realizes this can't go on. This fantastical hope, this limitless vision of who I am or who life is or what life is. And on the other side of that is a temporary kind of despair, if that's what we've been identified with too wholeheartedly. But we come through it with our feet on the ground and a different kind of muscularity in the soul that we may not have realized we were lacking, because the archetype can often carry us above a fair amount of terrain that we were meant to plow through. And often as the hero archetype drops us to the ground, we realize how frail we've become, because the ego hasn't been carving out and transforming its field into a fertile farm, but has been living very far away, dealing with life, actually with a rather light hand. So there's a lot of work to be done when we crash to the ground.
And we have to let ourselves crash to the ground. We have to give our assent to that. And it is disorienting, confusing. There's a time of feeling lost. And the hope is, as you said, Joseph, that a new kind of muscularity, a new ground of our being will emerge out of the initial difficulty and kind of chaos.
So it seems as we've circumambulated around the archetype of the hero that there are so many images that rise up out of the hero archetype, as is true of all archetypes, that in our culture there's a great prioritization of heroic images that show up in movies constantly and even in commercials for that matter. And that while the hero is an essential assistance at certain stages in our lives, it can become a kind of crippling defense against psychospiritual maturation later in life. And so while we can't dispose of the hero archetype, I think we need to develop a kind of objectivity that allows us to sacrifice that attitude at the right time and to realize that it's holding us back. And that can often put us into life in a renewed way, just as Jung was saying, that we need a new God. And by that he meant a new vision of life, a new vision of our own potential to carry us through this last third of our time on this earth.
And perhaps that's a good place to switch to a dream.
Hey, Lisa, what's been going on about your book?
Well, it was released on May 25th and sales have been strong. And I've been receiving so many lovely emails and texts and phone calls from friends and from people that I don't know telling me how much they've enjoyed the book. And so that feels really great. The reviews on Amazon have all been glowing, and that's been really heartening. It's just really wonderful to know that this project of mine is resonating with so many people.
I'm just so happy for you. And it's such a lovely, lovely book, both deep and accessible, about the inner journey around being a mother. That's never been written about. It hasn't been out there. And that it's getting such an enthusiastic, heartfelt reception. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I would love it if listeners who've read the book could write a review on Amazon, because although there are many wonderful ones there, more is always better. So thanks in advance for that.
You've really incarnated something that was in the ethers, but needed to be pulled down, needed to be shaped in words, and needed to be made accessible. And proof in the pudding is that it's beginning to have a kind of life of its own in the collective.
Yes.
That speaks a lot to the timeliness of this.
Yeah, I think you're right, Joseph.
The analogy to a baby is just too rich and too good and too multifaceted to be missed. It's having a life of its own, which is just what we want.
That's right.
So our dreamer today is a 36-year-old male who works as a writer. And here's his dream. It's a bright, clear day, and I'm in a forest. I'm walking around when I spot these hybrid creatures, both boar and human, or humans wearing boar heads as helmets. They're absolutely terrifying, and I try to hide from them in the brush. I watch them. Suddenly, one veers off from the rest and leans over and defecates or vomits from its chest. It's violent and disgusting. The creature seems weakened, sick. Then I'm walking again, trying to get away from the creatures, but they spot me, at least one of them does. I'm not afraid now, and assume we will fight. There's a group of swords on the ground, more like big serrated knives, and I pick one up. The creature and I duel, and I cut it several times. I'm confident in my victory, but then I'm nicked on the face. I'm worried about this, maybe it's worse than I know. Then the dream jumps, and I'm in a dark bathroom examining the cut in the mirror. It's a scratch. The boar creature is here with me, but she's a beautiful brunette woman, and it's clear we're lovers. The feeling now is very light and romantic and easy. And he adds as context, as with most people in these times, I feel I have to make a change in my life. I have to recommit to my dreams and imagination in a way that currently eludes me. I have to grow in seemingly every aspect of my life. The main feelings in the dream were fear, disgust, mystery, curiosity, courage, confidence, love, and ease.
Oh my goodness.
And he adds, I had a dream years ago about another crisis point where I fought a woman warrior and defeated her easily and put her body in the sea. There were also gigantic boars attacking a massive city at night.
Well, it seems to me that this dream is just the perfect fit for what we have been talking about today, with his heroic battle and then a post-heroic epilogue as he's with a woman in the bathroom and he's lovers with the woman.
I'm actually just looking up boar in my symbol dictionary, and I think there's probably a lot here that is worth noting. Boars are solitary in the forest, and they were sacred to the god Ares, the god of war.
I think there's something so powerful in this image that the boar-human hybrid becomes a beautiful brunette after he's willing to duel with it.
Mm-hmm. And to duel with it and to suffer the nick, to suffer being wounded.
I'm just found myself thinking about it, thinking about so many fairy tales where something has been cursed and it's regressed into some kind of an animal or partial animal creature and has to be redeemed through some kind of interaction with the hero, as you were saying, Deb, to break the curse.
Yeah. And that in some fairy tales, it requires fighting or violence. Sometimes you befriend it or run away from it. But for example, in The Frog Prince, our little princess has to throw the frog against the wall to kill it, and then it transforms into a prince. And in the story of Prince Lindworm, this creature that is like a giant snake and devours women has to be defeated by one of his erstwhile brides who flays him raw, at which point he transforms into a prince. So this is really very mythical and archetypal here, and he is willing to engage in the battle. He overcomes his terror. He tries to hide. He watches. And then all of a sudden, he says, I'm not afraid now, and assume we'll fight. And he picks up the swords that are like serrated knives and enters into the archetypal battle with the dragon, figuratively speaking.
It's always so interesting when an element in a dream is wounded or overcome by the dream ego. That always feels to me potentially ambivalent. And that's why I'm picking up on the importance of the fact that he has been wounded. He's confident in his victory, but then there's this question of I've been wounded. So whatever this element is in the psyche, it has left a mark on him somehow I think that's important and maybe the key to the spell being broken, that he has been affected by this content.
And we also know from mythology how important the wounding is. I'm thinking of Chiron, the centaur, who had suffered a wound in his thigh that never healed and was always painful, or the Fisher King, same kind of theme. Those woundings humble us. They make sure that our heroic grandiosity is tempered by our vulnerability and suffering and the pain of the wound.
Talking about the cut, it seems in my imagination that when he cuts the boar, it's as if he's cutting his own face. That there's also this parallel nick that's given into both him and the creature, which I think also invites us to feel that the boar and the dream ego are one thing, that we can't hurt or nick something in the unconscious without nicking ourselves, so to speak. When we are at war in the dream, we are at war with ourselves in some manner. I'm also thinking that the boar or the wild pig is a very ancient symbol of the Great Mother, the theriomorphic Great Mother, who is the great sow. In the ancient world, the fact that a female pig could produce so many offspring and successfully feed them, and they would grow to maturity and were so self-sufficient and adaptive, seemed remarkable, as all acts of great fertility were noticed and had a huge impact on human culture. So the great sow was considered a symbol of fertility, unfettered, primal fertility. And so in a man's psyche, when the anima and the primordial mother are merged into this kind of boar-headed being, it's a sign that a very powerful amount of work and a kind of surgical work, frankly, needs to happen. And so the serrated knife can also be seen as a scalpel, that the archetypal great mother and the feminine soul in a man's psyche have to be separated out. The great mother, the great sow, has to be returned to the primordial forests and into her archetypal realm, and the anima has to be brought into current time so that the male ego can take the anima as a lover and take her humanized image home with him so that he can receive the benefits of being in contact with his soul. So turning this monstrous mother complex, is what I would imagine, inside of him into a vibrant, beautiful, appealing, soulful image that he wants to have around and wants to be connected to, certainly seems congruent with his desire in the context to recommit to his dreams and imagination and to grow, to want more for himself. And that inner woman that is standing with him is surely capable of facilitating some great measure of that.
So something primordial has been humanized in this encounter. And I'm also just noticing how the dream starts out with, it's a bright, clear day. And I'm in a forest, which is often a symbol for the unconscious. Well, I don't know that we go into the deep, dark woods with such brightness, and that echoes that sort of solar heroic energy that you've been mentioning, Joseph. And then after all these events transpire, he says the dream jumps and I'm in a dark bathroom. And so this bright, egoic, solar attitude has been transformed into something that is also has an echo of the primordial, but it's not so heroic. I mean, after all, bathrooms are where we defecate and take care of all kinds of very private, personal, unheroic matters. And that is where the beautiful dark brunette, his anima, his soul image, meets him. It's really, really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Real poetic justice here on the part of Psyche.
And that the dreamer has navigated something successfully. That at the end of that tumult, he feels this congruence with the anima figure, that they're lovers. There's a light romantic rapport. He's assessing himself in the mirror, which is a self-reflective process. He's looking at what he thought was an enormous wound, which turns out to be a scratch. That alone is a wonderful moment in analysis.
Yeah.
Where a client comes in there like, this thing, it happened to me when I was 10 years old,
Yep.
and it's mauled my soul. And of course, sometimes that's true, but not uncommonly, as we look and look and look and look, and sometimes there is a moment of clarity as an adult when we look in the mirror and we think, oh, wait a minute, that thing that happened when I was 10, compared to who I am now, that's kind of just a scratch.
Yeah.
May I have been overly preferring this story, this narrative, and what if it wasn't as affecting as I kept telling myself it was? Maybe I have grown far beyond that, and somehow I just didn't get a glimpse of that.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.